Hello and welcome to another episode of Her Entrepreneurial Rise, the podcast where we amplify the stories of women and gender-expansive leaders using entrepreneurship as a force for social change. Because their stories aren't just inspiring, they're blueprints for what's possible when equity leads the way. I'm your host, Kelen Tamurian, and I'm thrilled to introduce today's guest, Jessica Tollenaar Cafferty, Best Starts for Kids co-lead and former childcare policy lead for King County. Jessica's leadership exemplifies the power of intrapreneurship, driving meaningful, equity-centered change from within a well-established public institution. Best Starts for Kids is a visionary, community-driven initiative funded by a voter-approved levy designed to ensure every child and family in King County grows up happy, healthy, safe, and thriving from prenatal development through early adulthood. What sets Best Starts for Kids apart is its unwavering commitment to equity. Race, income, or zip code should never determine a child's ability to thrive. By partnering with over 300 grassroots and community-based organizations, Best Starts for Kids develops culturally responsive programs that meet families where they are, with resources and support that truly reflect their lived experiences. Jessica's work, grounded in innovation, collaboration, and systemic change, highlights how deep knowledge of community needs, combined with strategic use of existing resources, can create large-scale impact. Her story reminds us that you don't always have to start a new venture to lead entrepreneurial change. Sometimes the greatest innovation comes from reshaping systems from the inside out. I'm so honored to be speaking with Jessica today, and I know her story and her dedication to nurturing equitable futures for children and families will leave you inspired and deeply connected to the mission of Best Starts for Kids. So with that, let's dive in. Hi, Jessica. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Kelen. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So to kind of just get right into it, Best Starts for Kids centers equity and holistic support to ensure every child and family can thrive. Why is this ethos of equity personally important to you?
So, Starts, as you shared, is an initiative at King County that really directly came from community. And it's really focused on ensuring that every kid and family has the opportunity they need to thrive in whatever ways they define for themselves. I think this is really important to me personally because of a few things. First, I'm a mom of two kids, and so there's a deep personal connection to thinking about what it looks like to support our babies, right? And to support them not just when they're young, but really as they grow up through their lifespan, which is the approach that we're taking here at Best Starts. But I'm also the daughter of a single mom. And so I know what it looked like in my early years for her to sort of navigate being the first in her family to go to college when she graduated when she was 41, really figuring out how to raise a kid on her own and really being deeply rooted in community, which is the reason that we were okay. I see that systems are shaped by racism, by other systems of oppression, and it is critically important to me that those experiences that were so pivotal for my family are something that are accessible and available to every family across King County. This is also where I'm from. This is my community. I grew up in King County, mostly in the Seattle area, and continue to live here. And so I feel personally really invested in making sure that we are leading that shift within our community here.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think what I really love about being able to talk to leaders, entrepreneurs, founders, I really love being able to dig into that personal why and understand the lived experiences that inform the decisions that we make to kind of chart our careers. And it feels maybe simple on its face to think about, okay, yeah, of course, if you experience something in your past that you might be interested in following a career path that allows you to kind of solve that issue or to create positive change around it. But I think it doesn't get talked about enough. And it also isn't something that everybody does or has the opportunity to do. And so I really love uncovering that because I think when entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship and entrepreneurial change are rooted in that lived experience, like you said, of you're a mom yourself, so you want to create a environment within King County that your children can thrive in, but also recognizing your experience as the daughter of a single mom and seeing the challenges that she faced in terms of accessing resources and figuring out how to raise a child and also try to finish college and all of those things. Recognizing from your own standpoint that there was so much room for growth in the area of ensuring that everybody has what they need to thrive, but then also being cognizant of the fact that as someone who is not as intimately, and I don't want to speak for you, but not as intimately impacted by these systems of racism and potentially classism as well, that you're acknowledging you and your mom may have had an easier time accessing resources than somebody else or than your neighbor in your community in King County. So bringing all of that together and recognizing that I want to ensure that everybody has access to the resources that they need to be happy and healthy and safe and be able to flourish in the community that I care so much about, because this is my home and this is where I grew up, is so inspiring and beautiful and feels very like full circle. And so I always love asking that question, because I think it really provides listeners, it provides me with the insight that there is so much room for exploration in terms of various different career paths just by tapping into what we know from our own lived experiences or from what we're observing in the world around us.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think, it's interesting. One of the things I didn't mention was that I started my career sort of dual in hospitality and restaurants, but also in early learning. And so I worked with kiddos really birth to aged 5. And one of my early experiences was working in an inclusive program that served kids with disabilities as well as kids who were typically developing. And it was really interesting because we were a lot of times the last stop, right, for families who'd been expelled from numerous programs, right, who were really struggling to find an early learning place, a place for childcare, a place that their kid could be safe. They would accept their kid, accept their family. And what that meant was that realistically, because of the systems that you're naming, we served a lot of families who were kids of color navigating systems that really weren't built for them,
Hmm.
families who were navigating systems that really weren't built for them. We served a lot of kids who were navigating the foster care system or child welfare system. We served a lot of families who were navigating housing instability. So, I think that was also really formative to sort of see just how early systems are really designed to either support families in nurturing, caring for their own kids in the way they already know how to do, right? Or really set up to prevent them from accessing very basic needs that I would actually say should be rights for every family.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, just that provides more color to why you've been able to do such incredible work in your position, but also just it provides more color to the problem at hand that you were able to witness, like from your own experience, but also in that early formative work with those roles that you were in. Being, I think, I mean, you just said it perfectly, that seeing that how early these systems really hinder or allow families to flourish. They hinder that flourishing or allow families to flourish depending on race, class, ethnicity, disability status, etc. So thank you for sharing that. And I think this is kind of a perfect segue in terms of you just describing seeing how those systems impact people early and then how they might continue to impact them throughout their life. Best Starts for Kids programming is intentionally designed to support children and families across various life stages, from prenatal development to early adulthood, age 24. How exactly does Best Starts for Kids do this, and what role have you played in helping ensure that equity remains at the center of those supports?
I love this question because I think it's core to everything we're doing at Best Starts. And part of the reason that I've been with Best Starts for so long, because I've been here for about 8 years, which is the longest I've ever been with any organization. And I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. And I think really what it comes down to is that we have been really intentional about rethinking what our role is as government, right? There are so many places where I think government serves really important roles, and this is one of them. But I think we're really rooted in this ethos of believing that community holds powerful expertise about what they need, their strengths. In particular, families understand their children and ways of being with one another and caring for one another in addressing both challenges and opportunities that really could never be replicated at sort of a mainstream white dominant systems level. And so a lot of our work is really thinking about how do we support the incredible work that's already happening or that community knows needs to happen? And how do we sort of re-center community as expert rather than us? We take a lifespan approach because I think we hold that sort of community expertise and then brain science as sort of key components of what led to the creation of Best Starts for Kids. And what we know is that there are these really important early intervention points between sort of prenatal, that time all the way to age 5. And that then it doesn't stop, right? That there are these transitions, there are life changes, there are academic things that kids go through and young people go through and families go through. And so we need to really be intentional about providing a lot of support early on, but then also making sure that we're available, that there's never a wrong time to be able to access the resources that you need, that your family needs, right? And that we have to sort of sustain the early investments throughout a child's life. Um, I think the reality is whatever choice you're making around whether or not you sort of center equity, whether it is an intentional and explicit commitment or not, will either further or hinder progress toward equity. And so if Best Starts really wasn't committed in saying, how do we intentionally look at not just disparities, but opportunity? Because I think that's really key, right? We don't want to just prevent harm. We actually want to think about how are we supporting every kid and family in flourishing in their full well-being. If we're not explicitly incorporating a focus on equity and looking at data and responding to community feedback and sort of continuously learning and evolving and making sure that we're responding to the fact that that experience looks really different for different families, depending on exactly the factors that you described, right? Race, disability status, sexual orientation, any number of factors there. We're actually making a choice to exacerbate those disparities for families. And so I think it's sort of a continual commitment to come back to. I think the other thing that comes up a lot for Best Starts for Kids is who we partner with and how, right? And so we don't always get it right. We're not always perfect. We are still a big government entity. But I think we've taken a really intentional approach to saying, how do we partner not just with large mainstream organizations who are, of course, doing really important work that we need to support, but also with grassroots, community-led, really deeply rooted organizations, some of whom have never worked with government before. And what does it look like to work with those organizations in a way that supports them? Because it doesn't just look like giving them a contract, right? It looks like offering capacity building. It looks like offering technical assistance in the application process, making sure that people have support in the language they need. It looks like ideally when we run into challenges, having a really relationship-based approach to saying, how do we support you in meeting these expectations that we have to hold because we want to be good stewards of public dollars, but doing it in a way that is really strengths-based and supportive rather than sort of a gotcha. And all of that is a very, very different approach than I think what most of government is historically and currently doing. And so I think some of it is about the what we're doing and how, like who we're investing in and why. But a lot of it is actually in the nitty-gritty of the how. How are we going about this work and how are we really deepening those relationships and trust?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you said so much there that I really, as a gender, women, and sexuality studies student I also studied law, societies, and justice. So very like social justice, social impact focused. It's like music to my ears thinking about how you are part of a big government entity and government has done this kind of work very differently for a very long time. And so the fact that you are going directly to the communities that have been historically oppressed and marginalized in terms of the access that they've been able to have to various different opportunities and really leveraging their experience as expertise. Like you know how to take care of your children and you know what barriers that you are facing that we want to co-create the solution with you and ensure that your voices are centered at the table when we're devising these solutions and creating these policy changes because you matter and the end goal is to create equity across the board for everybody, then everybody needs to be included in the decisions that are being made. And I also really appreciate the perspective that you offered in terms of we are leveraging that community expertise, but we also are blending it with that kind of brain science, like you mentioned, of we know that at these different developmental stages in children's lives, they need different supports physically, psychically, or psychologically, that we're leveraging the actual science and also what these communities believe and know to be true for what their children need. I think that's really, really important, not just kind of creating that like top-down model of this is what the science says, so this is what we're going to do, but blending it together. And then also in terms of how Best Starts for Kids works with those grassroots organizations that maybe have never worked with government before, but have, again, that expertise about this is how we cultivate equity and support for our community members, how can we bridge that with what the government is able to provide in terms of monetary resources and greater levers of support that these grassroots organizations, because they're grassroots, they're likely not funded very well. How can we support what they're doing and bridge it into the change that we as King County and Best Starts for Kids want to implement into the community?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's really, really important work. And we kind of touched on this a little bit, but financial barriers often prevent families from accessing quality childcare, and childcare workers themselves frequently face low wages. In Washington, the average annual cost of daycare for an infant is $21,348, and the average annual cost of daycare for two children is over $38,000. Meanwhile, childcare workers in Washington, 94% of which are women and predominantly women of color, earn an average annual wage of $40,720. This is the second highest mean wage nationally for this occupation, but it still falls short of meeting basic living needs and living costs in Washington in 2025, where a single worker needs around $70,000 a year to afford a one-bedroom apartment in the city. So I'm interested in learning more about how Best Starts for Kids childcare subsidy and wage boost programs that we haven't touched on yet, but that I'm excited to dive into. How do these programs help to close gaps in childcare access as well as ensure the childcare workers are supported?
Yeah, this is some of, I think, our most exciting work right now. I say that about all of our work. I feel like all of our work is exciting, but the childcare work, I think, is a really beautiful space for a few different reasons. And I think for me, one of the things I love about investing in childcare and really thinking about how we do that well is that it is such a powerful tool, such a powerful lever for equity when we support it well. Right. And when we listen to and center families and providers in the conversation and in the policy decisions we're making. And I think it can also be a really powerful lever to move towards inequity, right? When families can't access it, and when they can't access care that meets their needs, when they face, exclusionary discipline that's really racially driven. And for the workforce, which, as you described, is predominantly women of color, right? We have really built a system that has taken advantage of this deep care that predominantly women of color in King County in particular take in their work, right? I mean, this system didn't fall apart during COVID, and it didn't fall apart not because it was a sound business model. It didn't fall apart because the women of color who are doing this work wouldn't let it fail.
Mhm.
That's a level of commitment. And I think, we have sort of a policy obligation at this point to say we can't build a system on the altruism of the workforce, right? That is a gender equity issue, it's a racial equity issue, and it's one that is way overdue.
Mhm.
So we have two investments in childcare that I think blend really beautifully together. And they are two pieces of a really big, sort of holistic view that we have of working towards a thriving system. The first is the subsidy program, and that is a program that is really offering financial support for families who aren't eligible for other childcare subsidy programs in Washington state. And those can include things like families who are just above the sort of income eligibility threshold. There's a lot of families who, because of cost of living in Seattle in particular, right, might make too much money to qualify for the state subsidy program, but there's no world in which they could afford the full cost of childcare, which can be, far, far above what is affordable for most families. But it also includes a lot of families, and this was a specific policy choice, who are actually income eligible for the state's program. So these are families who are low income families living in King County, but who aren't eligible for other reasons. And that can be things like activity requirements, right? These can be families who maybe aren't working. There are trade-offs to any policy choice that you make. And I think we made a really intentional choice to say, you don't have to earn the right to childcare as a family, right? We made an intentional policy choice to say, we don't believe you have to be working in order to receive childcare for your kid. We believe that childcare can be a protective factor. We believe that if families say we need care for our child, that they do, right? That they don't have to sort of earn that or prove it to us.
Mhm.
And so, of course, we do have some income eligibility guidelines because there are limited funds. But I think what we're trying to do is sort of demonstrate that childcare isn't just a tool to get people to work, although that is something that we see. So, like 95% of our families that are receiving subsidy reported that they were able to pursue career and educational goals in a way that they wouldn't have been able to without childcare subsidy. But we didn't have a requirement for them to be able to access it in the first place. And so I actually would say maybe that's an argument for us to not require specific activities for families to access this. We hear a lot about, sort of the well-being of families being able to spend time with their kids and have reduced financial stress and being able to access basic needs once that sort of weight of the cost of childcare is lifted.
Mhm.
So I think that's really a beautiful investment because it is both a service that's sort of urgently and immediately needed in community, but I also think it's demonstrating some really specific policy choices that could pave the way for bigger changes to systems beyond King County. The other childcare work that we're doing is a wage boost pilot project, and this one's really exciting too. We're working with about 1,400 childcare workers between now and the end of 2027, and um, the project is really looking at what is the impact of when government invests directly in the wages of this workforce, right? We know it's a broken model. We know families can't afford the full true cost of what it takes to provide childcare. And we know that workers are making very little because this is a really staffing intensive sector. And so, I think we're operating from a place of recognizing there's going to have to be additional funding. And we really believe this is something that every family should be able to access and that everyone in the workforce should, be well compensated for. And so we're offering about a $4 an hour wage increase for each worker that's enrolled in this pilot. And then we're working with some incredible partners to kind of understand what the impact of that is, both in terms of, retention and stability and what the care looks like, but also in terms of the impact on the workers themselves, right? Their own well-being, their own sort of ability to access things that otherwise they might not have been able to, and how critically important that is.
Yeah. I mean, both of those programs, I think your point earlier that I feel like every program that we're doing is so exciting, but this one particularly, I agree with you. I think it's really, really exciting and important. Specifically, I mean, both, but I'll start with the subsidy um, program first because that's where we started. But I think your point that we can't continue to rely on the altruism of the workforce, that this is not something it creates gender equity issues, race issues, and it's just not sustainable. It's not feasible. It never was, and it shouldn't continue to be the model. And so the fact that the program is being enacted and allowing families to access care that is so needed. And I think also to your point that we don't require that we don't have those specific activity requirements, that they have a job, that they quote unquote need childcare because they have to work. Childcare is, I think, the saying is old, but it's there for a reason, that it takes a village to raise a family, that we aren't necessarily supposed to do this alone. And childcare is so integral to that. And so it shouldn't necessarily be that, oh, I'm only allowed to have help if I have a job that I have to leave my home for. So creating a program that allows more families to access that support and that also directly supports the childcare workers as well, specifically also through the wage boost program, ensuring that they have those additional resources and treating this as kind of a pilot experiment of how is this working in practice? Does it actually foster the change that we were hoping that it did? Then being able to take that data at the end of 2027, is that the year that you said that it would be done?
The end of 2027.
Yeah, so taking that data at the end of that year and seeing, did this actually work? And then being able to iterate on that and make changes to ensure that it actually does meet the needs of the childcare workers and allows families to access childcare in a way that feels culturally responsive and that feels supportive for them. All of that together just feels very, very important and needed. I just think both of the programs that are being piloted in this sector, in this area, are just so thoroughly thought out. And I think that is really inspiring as someone who cares deeply about social justice and about social change, but also as someone who has studied the government and recognizing that this isn't always how the process goes in terms of developing policy. And you were touching on that a lot but I think it's just very inspiring, and I'm excited to continue to follow up with Best Starts for Kids and see how this pilot program really impacts the childcare workforce, and to just keep up with what you're doing because it's really, really inspiring.
Kelen. I do think one thing that I just want to say about the pilot that I think is important to hold too is that the question that we're asking is really specific. It's not just saying what happens when workers are paid more, right? Because I think in general, we know what that probably will do for most workforces. It's actually saying, what's the benefit of government investing?
Mm.
And so it's a really clear policy question to look at what our role and obligation, right, to community, to this workforce as a public good, as infrastructure, what that really looks like. And I do really hope that that paves the way for larger scale policy changes about how we think about childcare. We have all of the evidence in the world to understand that it is worth every dollar we put into it. We have all of the evidence in the world to understand the impact of really high quality early learning on not just children who attend childcare, but their families, right, and community more broadly. And I think we have a lot of evidence already about how incredibly skilled and experienced and dedicated this workforce is. And so I think the moment is really ripe for some pretty significant policy changes that I think would benefit families across our community.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And from what I've gathered here today about your work with Best Starts for Kids, I really see it as a vital force for driving equitable systemic change in child and family support across King County. I think what you just said really encapsulates that of what is the role of government in driving that forward, and how can we kind of change the way that process has worked over time.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to learn more about the behind-the-scenes leadership and strategic collaboration that you've pioneered to bring your vision for health equity and childcare to life within a large public institution. So I'd love to hear how you went about building support inside King County to address the gaps and challenges you saw in childcare policy and offerings, and how you communicated your vision in a way that inspired others to join you in making these programs a reality. So to kind of start with that, I'm curious how you leveraged existing resources or secured early funding to get these programs off the ground. Were there particular partnerships or approaches that were crucial in these early stages?
Yeah. It's such a good question, and I think a really important one, because I think there's lots of us sitting in government who want to do work like this and sometimes are stuck within kind of that grinding of bureaucracy, which is real. I think first I have to give credit to those who came before me in Best Start. Sheila Ader-Kapistani is an incredible leader in King County community and was really the founder of Best Starts for Kids. She came in as someone who was deeply rooted in perinatal work, in early childhood work, in youth work. And she really, I think, laid the vision in partnership with community for a different way of doing this work. And similarly, Jen DeYoung and Marcy Miller came and were, I think, really critical people in helping sort of navigate the complexities of working within government to create change. Because I think you have to be willing to understand when to pick battles, when to push against, right? When to build really strategic partnerships with people that like maybe never saw themselves in social change movements, but are critically important folks in contracting and finance and all of the things that actually are sort of the how of what happens here. So I think I was really fortunate to step into a program management role when I first came to King County, where this beautiful groundwork had already been laid. Sheila Ader-Kapistani, who I named, had really come and said, we have to have deep community input if we're going to do this work. And so Best Starts from the very beginning, from its passage and its beginning in 2015, was really shaped by community feedback, all of it, right? How long we offer grants for, what our priorities were, how we make award determinations, right? We invite community members into all of these spaces and make sure that we are really continually grounded in that. And so I name that just to say that, like, I didn't come into a space where none of this was built. I came in where there was already a really beautiful foundation laid. That being said, we've had, a really significant number of events over the past 8 years, both in terms of, our federal government context and a global pandemic and, sort of growing mental health crises among young people and their families. And so, I think it has been important for me to recognize that there is no end point here. There's no end point where we've sort of checked it off, we've transformed systems, and we're done. I think the system, Dr. Rochelle Rogers-Ard, who's an incredible educator that we work with often, talks a lot about, I think with critical race theory that the system will always revert back to white dominant culture. And so how do we continually commit to that push, right? How do we continually come back to saying we're not going to revert? And I think that has been a lot of what my roles have looked like. When I was operating as childcare policy lead, I did have this opportunity to build new and exciting work. And I think that is sort of the place that I love, is either navigating through crisis or change or building something new. I am not a maintainer. I know when it's time for me to tap out and hand over the reins to someone else. But I think, we had seen such significant need around childcare, both from the sort of workforce perspective and family perspective. And when COVID started, within a couple of days, it was really clear to me, having been working with a number of providers, that we were headed for this sort of massive crisis. We didn't have guidance in place yet for childcare workers. We were thinking about how we were going to get essential workers to work. Many of these people have children, and we were seeing childcare providers not really know how to continue. Do I stay open? Do I close? What does it look like? Childcare providers are mostly small businesses, and even though very few of them actually make a real profit, most of them also aren't technically nonprofits. So they were also exempt for a lot of the resourcing that was coming in for nonprofits and public sector. And so, I went to Sheila Ader-Kapastani, who was at that time one of the co-leads for Best Starts for Kids. And I was like, we've got to figure something out here. And so we jumped in with a bunch of people who were, I think, unafraid of the messy, and said, what can we do? What is possible? And we knew it wouldn't be perfect, and we knew it wouldn't be everything. But we really quickly, I think within a couple of weeks, got $2 million reallocated to preserve a number of slots for essential workers in childcare facilities across King County. And we partnered with a community-based organization that has really deep relationships with providers, because we knew we didn't have the same I think, community trust and buy-in and relationship. And so we worked really quickly to set that up. We were able to sort of preserve access for a number of essential workers, which felt really critical in that moment. That ultimately sort of snowballed, right? We ended up running 3 emergency programs, and each time we learned a little more, right? The first time we learned, okay, we had this really narrow scope of what we thought of as essential workers. Childcare providers are essential workers. We had all these other people that we realized were really critically important. And so we grew that. We saw where we, had moved quickly, and there were these unintended consequences of families moving their kids from one program to another program. And we had to think about, how do we make sure that doesn't negatively impact this provider, and find resources to address those challenges. And so we were sort of rapidly iterating as we were implementing. And, I think it was a really sort of once in a lifetime moment of policy and program design, implementation, refinement all at once, because we had, I think, deep trust with our leadership. Our executive and council knew who we were and our work and our relationship with community. We had community partnerships, so we had deep relationships with providers. In that way, we could really think about how we could continue to get feedback. And there was a sense of urgency that allowed us to jump in a way that, while I don't think any of us wish COVID had happened, did provide kind of a necessary catalyst for us to say, how do we address this? And that, I think, laid the groundwork then for when we looked at Best Starts renewal, when we looked for going back to voters and saying, will you renew this levy? Adding a really big investment, $200 million investment in childcare over 6 years. Because we had demonstrated, actually, there is a role for the county to play here. And maybe it's not the role we always need to play, but in this moment, there are gaps for our community, and there are places that we can be innovating, and we are ready to step into that space. And so it was thrilling and terrifying and hard, and there were things that were beautiful and huge successes, and there were places that were, really hard challenges where we had to think quickly to make sure that we didn't end up causing harm to the childcare workforce, right, or to families. But I think that willingness to just sort of sit in the gray and sit in the urgency and figure out how we were going to make it happen, and know that we were going to continue to change it and work on it as we learn more, was really transformative and powerful.
Yeah. That was such wonderful context and such a great example of what entrepreneurial leadership is. It's recognizing that, and you said this, you touched on this, that it's not that this need wasn't always there, but COVID really exacerbated the need to support childcare workers and to support essential workers across various sectors. And so recognizing that this problem has always existed, but that it's exacerbated at this specific moment in time because of various factors. How can we now sit in that gray and really work to make a change immediately so that we can support people? Because if we don't, people's lives are on the line, their families suffer. Like it's really important. And so I love that because it's such a great example of what it looks like to holistically address a problem, recognizing that like we have the resources that we have in terms of monetary access to monetary resources with the levy, and then contracting with other kind of governmental funding to get that support there, but also leveraging your partnerships and relationships with the community organizations that are really much more tapped into these communities of essential workers that maybe don't have, like you said, that buy-in and that trust with the government yet. And so recognizing that like we have what we have to bring to the table, but we also know that we need to call in others to ensure that we can actually serve the needs of the community that is in need right now. And so again, it's that idea of co-creating these solutions with people that can fill in the gaps where you are lacking, and not just trying to have that white dominant, like top down model that we've talked about and that you mentioned earlier in this conversation, specifically around this question. But really that idea of co-creating these solutions and leveraging partnerships and leveraging the community expertise and knowledge of others and working together to build something that meets the needs of everybody. I think that is something that entrepreneurs across industry and across sector need to be thinking about, that it's not just what you bring to the table, but it's what you actually don't know and that you need to go out and outsource, because your solution will only be that much more robust and that much more impactful if you bring in the voices of all of those who might be touched by or impacted by the solution that you're trying to create. So I just appreciate you so much for sharing your experience with Best Starts for Kids in that way, because I think it provides such valuable insight for listeners and also for other potential entrepreneurs or founders or individuals that are working in government that might be listening, that it is not just a one person or one group of people job. It should be a community endeavor.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So to kind of wrap up, what advice would you offer to someone with an entrepreneurial mindset and desire to do impactful work and make a change in their community or field?
I think a couple things. And it's funny because I don't know that I always feel like I have a lot of advice to give because I still feel like I'm figuring it out. But I think the first thing is to have real clarity around who you are and your values. Right. I think working particularly within a government system for folks who are interested in creating social change within a government system, and particularly with a focus on racial equity or any kind of social justice, right? You're going to have to hold this tension of working within a system that is fundamentally built in the lens of all of those systems of oppression, right? Very much any government system is very much built in white dominant culture
Mhm.
and will always reinforce those things unless we are actively shifting it. And so, what does it look like to be a part of that, to be a part of that system while you are also trying to move toward anti racism or while you are also trying to move toward justice? Um, I think the only way that I have been able to hold that tension, and sometimes that's really hard and sometimes it's easier, it depends on the day and sometimes the moment, is to be really clear on who I am, on my values, on my deal breakers, right? I can be pragmatic about places that are not 100% in alignment if I'm moving towards those goals. But I also know where my line in the sand is, right? I know um, I know the lines that I won't cross, right? The places where if I were actively contributing towards inequity or actively working against my values, those are places that I feel really clear I can't occupy. So I think that's the first one, is to have a really clear sense. And I think knowing yourself is also about, sort of to what you said, Kellen, knowing your role, either as an individual or a team or an initiative. I think one of the best things I've done in this job is hire people who are way smarter than me and way better at certain things than me, because there are places that I'm really good, and then there are places that I am just not the one. And by assembling, I think, really incredibly thoughtful people with diverse lived experience and skill sets and strengths, it's just a much better product. And so I think don't be intimidated by people who are smarter than you. Invite them in. They will make it better. And then, I think the last thing is just that this isn't easy, right? And so if you're doing this work, you have to find ways not to tap out, but to breathe, right? To reflect. I make my worst mistakes and do the worst things when I'm not reflecting and when I'm moving too quickly. And so even in moments of crisis, even in moments of urgency, making sure that you are taking the space to reflect, to rest, and then to be able to come to the work with intention and the care that it deserves. I think those are the things that are really critical. And obviously, of course, always community voice, right? I mean, if you're working in social change and you're not centering the experiences of the actual human beings who are living that change, you shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. That was such sound advice in everything that you said. I'm in my senior year of college, and so I've been talking about what's next with my friends and my classmates and my peers, and we have all the people that I surround myself with also care deeply about social justice and social change, and we don't want to contribute to the perpetuation of these dominant systems of oppression, but we also recognize that they're not going to change overnight. And so to your point of if you deeply value social justice and you want to be a part of creating change, you are likely going to have to sit in and hold that tension. And so knowing what your values are and knowing where you can't work and where in the spaces that you aren't able to occupy, I think that's such sound advice and something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of like what really does matter to me and what can I be okay with having a little bit of discomfort around in terms of this aspect of injustice is more present in this area here right now. How can I develop a sense of, and it feels weird to say, but develop a sense of comfortability around that, knowing that like we are actively working on changing it, but it still doesn't feel great right now because equity doesn't live here yet. So I really, really love that advice. And then also your point of surrounding yourself with and hiring people, if you're in a position to do that, people that are smarter than you and that have different experiences than you and have different lived experiences than you and can bring different insight to the table when you're co-creating these solutions together. I think it's easy to fall down the comparison kind of rabbit hole of, oh, but they have this experience and they did this internship and they're so much smarter than me. And, speaking from the student perspective, but really what I've recognized over time and that I try to kind of instill in any friends or people that come to me and are sharing, like, I'm feeling a little bit nervous about this because I'm going up for this application, but this person has this experience and I don't. Like, we all have valuable experience to bring to the table, and there's only something to learn from each other. So it's better to surround yourself with, and if you're in a position to hire people that are smarter than you and that have different experiences than you, because they're not necessarily going to be smarter than you in every capacity. We all have different skill sets, but we're only stronger together. So I think that perspective is really helpful too. If you're building a team around an entrepreneurial idea, like, bring people in that have different strengths, because that's only going to allow you to build a solution that's that much more impactful. And then to your last point of centering the community voice, if you are stepping into social justice work, but even if you're not, if you're building a product or a service, you can't just build something that you like or that you want to see. You have to recognize, like, how is this impacting everyone, and how does this actually does it even meet the needs of the people that I'm hoping that it does? And if it doesn't, you need to center their voice in the iterations that you make on your product or your solution next. So I think that was such a wonderful encapsulation of so many important kind of golden nuggets of information. And I just appreciate you so much for sharing that.
Thanks, Kellen. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. This was such a wonderful conversation. I learned so much, and I know that our listeners will learn so much, or definitely did learn so much from your story and your experience. So thank you again for making the time. And for everybody listening, please go and check out what Best Starts for Kids is doing. I'll link their website in the show notes below. It's really, really an exciting opportunity to think about how governmental work can pivot and change to actually better meet the needs of the community that it's designed to serve. So with that, just thank you so much for coming on. It was such a pleasure to talk to you today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kellen. It was a real joy to talk with you, and I'm excited for everything that you will do after graduation as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Her Entrepreneurial Rise podcast. The Her Entrepreneurial Rise podcast was founded, hosted, and produced by me, Kelen Tamurian, president of the We Lead Student Board, with support from the Burke Center for Entrepreneurship in the Foster School of Business at the University of Washington. I'm so grateful to have you along for these conversations, amplifying the stories of impact-minded women and gender-expansive innovators whose ventures and life's work shine a bright light on the radical possibility of entrepreneurship as an engine for positive social impact. If you'd like to learn more about the entrepreneur or leader featured in this episode, their journey, business, and mission, be sure to check out their website and social media platforms, all linked in the show notes. There you'll also find a list of the statistics, articles, and resources mentioned in this conversation for your further research and exploration. To stay connected with the Her Entrepreneurial Rise podcast and the Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership Program at the Burke Center for Entrepreneurship at the University of Washington, follow us on social media and visit our website, both linked below. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate, review, and share the podcast with a friend, classmate, or fellow believer in the power of entrepreneurship to spark positive change. Your support truly means the world and is the best way to help grow the show. I'm so happy you're here and part of the Her Entrepreneurial Rise community. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.